Okay, the reading for this week is a short essay by the great literary critic and literary theorist of the 20th century, Kobayashi Hideo, and the essay is called Kokyō. And we will be reading for this class the English translation of it as well as the original Japanese. You will have the PDF files for both of those. The translation is taken from this excellent book by Paul Anderer, professor at Columbia University, I think, still. And I'll put the link to this book in the description so you can purchase it. And I may make a recitation video as well, so you can read the English translation and follow along to my video, but I'll do that at a future date. For now, I'm going to read these notes I took when I first read this back in grad school, and hopefully they will give you an idea of the major themes and the sort of issues that are at stake in this essay. Okay, so the essay is ushinatta Kokyō, translated by Anderer as Literature of the Lost Home. First published in May 1933, and I don't have the original journal in which the essay was published. We'll go over that in class. Okay, so 1933, Kobayashi Hideo's meandering essay, Literature of the Lost Home, is a roundabout attack on the nostalgic conservatism of writers like Taizakis Call, who sought to shed their Western pretensions and influences and return to Japan, Nihon no Kaiki, a position that was in step with the 1930s nationalist ideology that sought to purify first Japan and then the rest of Asia from the influence of the Western colonial powers. Okay, I should note here that Kobayashi Hideo is often thought of as a kind of conservative, as a representative of the conservative position in literature, in the arts, in culture. But this essay, I argue here in these short notes, kind of takes issue with this cultural conservatism that was ascendant in the 1930s in the context of this, I lost my place there. In the context of the so-called Nihon no Kaiki cultural movement that was taking shape in the 1930s. And he's sort of criticizing that and saying basically that there is no return to Japan. Any kind of return to Japan is impossible. And that's his sort of argument in this meandering essay, although it doesn't really have a logical argument in the normal sense that we think of arguments and essays and so forth. It's more of a Sicht. And all of his essays are kind of in the style of the more traditional Sicht essay form that is has been a major feature of Japanese literature since antiquity. All right. So he's critical of this effort to purify Japan and to return to some sort of imagined past. Kobayashi's main objection to such a notion is the following: the home, i.e. Japan as it existed before being corrupted by the West, is gone, and it isn't coming back. And any attempt to distill it from the heterogeneous present is bound to fail. History, he writes in the essay's closing paragraph, quote, seems always and inexorably to destroy tradition. And this inevitable process is not to be lamented, since individuals, as they mature, seem always and inexorably to move toward its true discovery. In this sense, end quote, in this sense, the work, though written in a style rich with nostalgic overtones, can be read as a sort of anti-nationalist tract, denying the possibility of ever returning to this largely invented pre-lapsarian Japan that writers like Tanizaki and Nagai Kafu thought to have once existed. Okay, let me give a disclaimer here that these notes I wrote about 10 years ago when I was still in grad school, so I may disagree with some of the points that I make here, and if I do, we'll go over those in class. But let me present the ideas that I had 10 years ago regarding this essay. Okay, on to his argument, which isn't really an argument, it's more kind of a loose collection of ideas and thoughts that he has about this issue. As the title suggests, Kobayashi, and by implication modern Japan, are without a home, in either the spiritual or a physical sense. Born in Edo, so he falls under the heading of the so-called Edoko. Kobayashi is a qualified Edoko, but he still feels himself to be more of a rootless abstraction than a man of any particular place. He ponders the phrase, born in Tokyo, and he concludes, I cannot fathom what that really means. Kobayashi notes that those born elsewhere seem to feel some sense of belonging and attachment to place. An example being his friend Taki Kosaku, born in 1894, who is a disciple of Shiga Naoya, the great novelist, who was visibly moved upon seeing his homeland, his Kokyō, from the train. But those born in Tokyo feel no such attachment to their city because there is no city. Instead, only, and I quote from his essay, an endless series of changes occurring too fast. And he's referring, of course, to the rapid industrialization and modernization that began in the Meiji period, and within the span of a few decades, Japan had completely transformed itself into something new. So for him, there is no Edo, there's no Tokyo, there's no city to which he belongs, but there's instead only an endless series of changes occurring too fast. Never was there sufficient time to nurture the sources of a powerful and enduring memory attached to the concrete and the particular. Okay, so there is no concrete, there is no particular, there's only this abstraction that is modern Tokyo, into which he was born. End quote. And not end quote, those are my comments. Having no vivid memories of any fixed time or place, the only way for Kobayashi to give shape and meaning to this reality of the past is to exaggerate it, or to impose upon it some unnatural structure. For example, a point of view or a critical perspective, as he puts it. In other words, like the pre-westernized Japan romanticized by the nationalists, the cultural nationalists, his own personal past must be reinvented for it to exist. The lost Tokyo of his memory serves, of course, as a half metaphor for Japan in the modern world. But before he makes this allusion entirely clear, this connection is entirely clear, he first elaborates on what he means by this lack of real substantive experience. The concrete things of the world having lost their correspondence with their ideal form. So we get the feeling here that he had Plato in the back of his mind in this section. And you'll note that Tanizaki, of course, was very influenced by the ideas of Plato and Neoplatonism in this period, in the fiction of this period. So I think I get the sense that a lot of Japanese intellectuals and writers were reading Plato in the 1930s, and you get the sense that Kobayashi has Plato in the back of his mind as he's writing this as well. Having lost their correspondence with their ideal form, have become nothing more than empty abstractions. The mountain, to Kobayashi, as he puts it, is no more than an abstract idea. The memories of his youth, of Tokyo, even of Japan as a national unit, these two are insubstantial phantoms. And I quote from the essay, "I know that my life has been lacking in concrete substance," he laments, and having, end quote, and having no concrete reality, he is left to live the only life available to him, namely that of the ruthless Benjaminian flaneur who floats about the city like a ghost, recognizing among the crowds only other fellow abstractions. So he doesn't even see other humans, especially among the intellectual and artist class. These are mere abstractions, just as he himself is a mere abstraction. Such a description brings to mind the superfluous men. I forget the Russian term for this, lichitsid or something. Superfluous men, this kind of archetype that is big in 19th century Russian fiction, came into in Japan through translations of Russian novels, and this was kind of a major archetype in Japan as well. So his description of himself and of other intellectuals and artists brings to mind the superfluous men of the novels of, say, Dostoevsky, who had a profound influence on Kobayashi. And Kobayashi, of course, later, after the war, I think he would write a full book, a full study of the novels and life of Dostoevsky. And the following passage from this essay sounds particularly Dostoevskian. And he writes, "I do not easily recognize within myself or in the world around me people whose feet are planted firmly on the ground, or who have the features of social beings. I can more easily recognize the face of that abstraction called the city person, the tokaijin in the original, who might have been born anywhere than a Tokyoite born in the city of Tokyo." So all city people, all cosmopolitan people have the same kind of aura about them, and they have no distinguishing features. The Tokyoite has no distinguishing features from the Osakaite or from the Shanghaiite, if that's a word. End quote. Kobayashi, the wandering flaneur, takes issue then next with Taizakis Call. So Taizaki Junichiro, the great novelist of this period. He takes issue with Taizakis call for a, quote, literature that will find a home for the spirit. Kobayashi is saying that that's impossible. How can there be a home for literature, he asks rhetorically, when there is no home for me, or for that matter, for any of us? Rereading Dostoevsky's Raw Youth, the story of a youth in turmoil because of Western ideas and who, in the midst of his intellectual agitation, has utterly lost his home, as he puts it, Kobayashi notes in the Russian experience a similar crisis of identity. So again, you see these similarities between the Japanese experience of modernity and this sort of clash with the West, or conflict with the West, or assimilation into the West in some ways. You see the similarities between the Japanese experience and the Russian experience. And Kobayashi is fond of bringing out those similarities in his writings. And there is a similar crisis of identity, and I quote, "How very closely he," the protagonist of Dostoevsky's novel Raw Youth, "how closely he resembles us," he remarks. "The intrusion and importation of the West has been a traumatic experience for Asia all across the board, Russia included." If you want to include Russia in the West, or at least half of it, Eurasia, a very important topic that we're seeing today. All these issues are being played out in real time right now with the Russia-Ukraine war. And the result has been this disorientation and loss of place. And I have a note here in my notes. At this point in his argument, the reader expects the essay to finish with a damning condemnation of the West and a call for some kind of culturally nativist revival, which is something that was ubiquitous at the time. But this, of course, does not happen, which is why I make a sharp distinction between Kobayashi and his ideas and the cultural nationalism that were ascendant at the time. Alright, moving on, next paragraph. Kobayashi now moves to the subject of popular fiction versus light fiction, both of which largely go unread by adults, who instead read only historical romances or magemono. With films, too, the most popular ones are those that take history as their subject, rather than contemporary events, as in the case of the West. The problem, Kobayashi explains, with works that address contemporary issues, gendaimono, to use the old Edo period word, as opposed to jidaimono, or jidaigeki, or sewamono, I think is the old word for that, is that they rarely convey in a stylistic manner a stream of emotions. Instead, they rely too heavily on plot, a device that seems more and more tedious as one matures aesthetically. Okay, so you also remember that around this time, or actually several years earlier, Tanizaki and Akutagawa had their famous so-called Shousetsu Suji Donso, the plot debate, and he might have had that in mind when he's writing this, and Kobayashi takes the side of Akutagawa over against Tanizaki, who favored the importance of plots in his novels. So plots for Kobayashi become more and more tedious as one matures, as a writer matures aesthetically, or a reader for that matter, and I quote, "Only when such youths reach maturity," he writes, "will the plot seem silly to them, and all but unconsciously will they begin to look for this kind of style that might conceal the silliness." This comment might be read as another attack on Tanizaki, who in the famous 1927 plot debate, the Shousetsu Suji Donso with Akutagawa, insisted that the most important element of fiction is plot, which ranks above poetic temperament, characterization, and all other elements, stream of consciousness and so forth, which Akutagawa privileged, in contrast to Tanizaki. Okay, moving on. Kobayashi gives further examples of genres that convey this stream of emotions. Historical romances and chambara movies exert a profound influence over the masses, and, quote, not because of their well-wrought plots, but rather due to, quote, the capacity of a film to make them unconsciously surrender to a stream of real emotions, end quote. The film Morocco, discusses in this essay several times. The film Morocco, we'll go over that in class, the details about this film. This film demonstrates this inexplicable style that elicits such an emotional stream. So this emotional stream is more important than plot for Kobayashi. Furthermore, the subjects of Western films, chambara or jidaigeki films, and magemono fiction are all sufficiently distant enough from us to attain a harmony between subject and form, he argues. And I quote again, this style elicits a sense of intimacy so that we feel closer to the Moroccan desert we have never seen than to the landscape of Ginza before our eyes. Okay, so it seemed like he went on a completely different path here and started discussing something completely unrelated to the first half of his essay, but he ties it all together by saying that basically this Moroccan desert seems more of a home for us, homeless modern Japanese, than our own home of Ginza and the landscape of Ginza that actually exists before our eyes. So relating back to this idea that he is an abstract man with no concrete home. In other words, employing stylistic techniques that distance the subject from the viewer can have the opposite effect of evoking a greater intimacy toward the work. So the farther removed something is from us, the closer we feel to it. Again, one hears echoes of Dostoevsky here, this time from Ivan of the brothers Karamazov, who in a conversation with his pious brother Alyosha remarks, so Ivan, you remember, is the more intellectual modern archetype, whereas Alyosha represents the old past of Russian Orthodox Christianity. And he says to his pious brother, "If I must love my fellow man, he had better hide himself, for no sooner do I see his face than there is an end to my love for him." End quote. Tanizaki, too, in his novel Chiji no Ai, which we've also read in this class, develops, translated as Naomi, in his novel Chiji no Ai, develops this theme of the inverse relation between distance and intimacy. So the further something is from you, the more erotic attraction you feel toward it. It is the same kind of dynamic or mechanism going on there as well. Like Tanizaki and Nagai Kafu, and like the militarists and cultural nationalists of the 1930s, Kobayashi is, albeit through ambivalent expression, grieving the loss of Japan's cultural singularity, as he calls it. Okay, so there are some similarities with these nostalgia, with this broader movement of the return to Japan and the nostalgia for the old Japan and the Edo Shumi, as it was called, that was around at the time. However, unlike the others, unlike the cultural nationalists, Kobayashi resists the urge to call for the restoration of what is lost. So he kind of accepts this loss and doesn't call for its restoration, which he knows would be mere fantasy. He is aware that even if this fantasy did once exist, and I suspect that he would be inclined to say that it never did, or at least not for him, it is useless to try and, like a shaman, bring it back from the dead. To begin with, how would one go about determining which parts of modern Japanese society and culture are Western and which are native? So they've become inextricable from each other. They're linked and can no longer be disentangled. What is crucial, he writes, is that we have grown so accustomed to this Western influence that we can no longer distinguish what is under the force of this influence and what is not. Okay, and I have another lecture where I talk about this influence within the Japanese language itself. It's almost impossible now to go through a newspaper article or a work of modern fiction and disentangle what ideas, what concepts, what words themselves are coming from the West or from interaction with the West, and which words are native to the Japanese language. Most jukugo or kango, Chinese words for example, came into Japan only through translations of Western languages, especially German and so forth in the 1890s and so forth. So he's making this point that it's because the West and Japan have become so enmeshed that you can no longer disentangle one from the other. So it would be foolhardy to even try to do so, is his point here. We have succeeded, he continues, in losing our native culture, he dryly remarks, the implication being that we intended to lose it, and now we must live with the consequences. Okay, so he's resigned to this track or trajectory that Japan embarked on in the Meiji period, and says we can't undo what has happened these last 5 decades. Okay, and finally at the end of these notes I have a brief note on some background information about Kobayashi Hideo, born in 1902, lived all the way through the war, into the post-war period, died at the age of 81 in 1983. According to many, he is the most important Japanese literary critic of the 20th century. Like Edmund Wilson, Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, Kobayashi Hideo sought to make criticism a literary genre of its own. He studied French literature at Tokyo Imperial University, as it was called back then, and translated French poetry and fiction. So he has several essays in this collection about Rimbaud and other French poets. He often talks about French fiction as well of the 19th century, naturalism and so forth. His critique of naturalism is also included in this book. He advocated an expressive, subjective, self-conscious, and self-questioning mode of criticism that, while bearing in mind the ideological designs of the day, challenged the validity of the many isms that were rampant then and are rampant in our world today. These samazama naru isho, as he called them, these sort of gestalten of consciousness, you might put it. So he sought to distance himself from all these various gestalten of consciousness and sort of create his own kind of standpoint from which he could look at the broader issues of culture. Anderer, Paul Anderer, the author of this book, translator here, writes in his introduction to this book, to his translated essays, that, quote, Kobayashi remains skeptical of the apparent stability of any announced position, whether Marxist, aestheticist, so Tambi Shugi, or nationalist, especially when these positions were conveyed impersonally as a dunning recitation of pre-selected facts or theories, end quote. One might, however, cite Kobayashi's behavior and writings during the war as evidence to the contrary. Okay, so there have been criticisms of Kobayashi and say that despite his attempt to show himself as somebody who is distancing himself from the nationalism of the time, he actually participated in it. He went to China and wrote sort of jingoistic essays that were very in support of the war and so forth. So there are elements of his writings that can be criticized on this point. But Anderer insists that throughout his career, Kobayashi advocated instead a criticism that was, quote, an exploration of consciousness, a matter of internal urgency, motivated less by general conditions of the world or even by habits of mind than by a specific provocation, a question that demands a personal response, end quote. Kobayashi brought what we might call a double vision to criticism, a double vision that at once looked outward at the work and inward at the self's subjective response to the work. So this is something that we seek to do whenever we read a work of literature or look at a piece of art. We want to analyze and interpret not only the work of art from kind of some objective standpoint, but we also want to look at our own internal responses to that work and analyze those as well. This idea sounds somewhat similar to Edward Said's notion of contrapuntal reading, which we'll talk about at some other point, and it might prove illuminating to do a comparative study of the two. That was an idea that I had about 10 years ago, not really necessary at this point. And then I have some final notes here on art, some notes about Taizakis' essay that he cites in his essay. And finally, what do I say here? Taizaki is popular mostly by youth. Kobayashi agrees. Okay, positively put, Kobayashi succeeds in a balancing act of sorts. On the one hand, he dances along those rhetorical lines used by the anti-Western nationalists who romanticize the innocent past, pre-Western Japanese past, while on the other hand, he seems resigned to a kind of open, cosmopolitan liberalism. So he doesn't side with either. He kind of sustains or maintains this tension between these two radical positions and kind of dances in between them. Negatively put, however, he is simply a flip-flapper, weaving in and out of a tenuous link of associations that have the cumulative effect of arguing both sides at once. Alright, that was just a final note there. Alright, hopefully this will help you, give you an idea of his larger critical project, and we will read these and analyze these essays in more depth in class. I will see you then. Hopefully you can hear me. It's early in the morning. I tend to mumble early in the morning before coffee. See you then. Goodbye.